It was a cold November night, and Michael, a 34-year-old cab driver, had just started his late-night shift. The city streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional pedestrian or dimly lit car passing by. Michael enjoyed these quiet shifts. They gave him time to think and escape the chaos of the daytime rush. But this night would be far from ordinary. Around 1:15 a.m., Michael got a call from dispatch about a pickup request near an abandoned industrial district. He hesitated for a moment but accepted. As he pulled up to the location, he noticed a figure standing under a flickering streetlight. The man was tall, wearing a long coat and a hat that obscured most of his face. "Are you Michael?" the man asked in a low, almost mechanical voice. Michael nodded and gestured for him to get in. Michael couldn't help but feel uneasy. The man sat perfectly still in the back seat, his eyes hidden under the shadow of his hat. "Where to?" Michael asked, trying to break the silence. The man simply replied, "Take me to 451 Sycamore Lane." Michael's stomach dropped. He recognized the address. It was an abandoned house known for its dark history. Suppressing his discomfort, he began driving. As they drove through the empty streets, Michael noticed odd things. The radio, which was off, suddenly emitted faint static. The passenger's reflection in the mirror appeared slightly delayed, as if it were moving a second behind him. When Michael glanced back, the man was sitting still, yet he felt like he was being watched. When they arrived, Michael felt a chill run down his spine. The house stood at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by overgrown trees. Its windows were boarded up, and the front door hung loosely on its hinges. The man leaned forward and whispered, "Wait here." Then he stepped out of the car and walked into the house without looking back. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. Michael sat in the cab, growing more anxious with each passing second. Suddenly he noticed movement in the house. Shadows flickered across the broken windows, accompanied by faint, muffled screams. Michael's instincts told him to leave, but he couldn't bring himself to start the car. After what felt like an eternity, the man emerged from the house. His coat was torn, and his hands were smeared with something dark. Without a word, he got back into the car and said, "Drive." His voice was colder, almost inhuman. Michael's hands trembled as he obeyed. As they drove, the man began to speak in a chilling monotone. He recounted events that hadn't happened yet: Michael's death, the accident that would end his shift, and the names of people he'd never met but somehow knew. Michael's fear reached a breaking point. Suddenly, a figure darted across the road. Michael swerved to avoid it, but the car skidded off the road and crashed into a tree. When Michael regained consciousness, the passenger was gone. The only trace of him was a dark stain on the back seat and a chilling note that read, "See you soon." Days later, Michael quit his job, unable to shake the memory of that night. But the terror wasn't over. Every night at 1:15 a.m. his phone would ring, and on the other end was static and faint whispers of his name. The old apartment building on Elmwood Street had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the stairwell creaked with every step, and most of the units were unoccupied. But for Emily and Jake, it was affordable, and it came with a promise of a fresh start. Little did they know this building had a past, a dark past that refused to stay buried. It wasn't long after moving in that Emily discovered the door. It was at the end of the narrow hallway leading to their unit, locked with a heavy padlock. When she asked the landlord about it, he brushed her off, saying, "That room hasn't been used in years." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind it, something watching. Their first night in the apartment was uneventful, at least at first. But as the clock struck midnight, Emily was jolted awake by a faint scratching sound. It was coming from the direction of the locked door. Jake dismissed it as rats, but Emily felt a chill she couldn't explain. Over the next few days, the whispers started. They were faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Emily heard them when she was alone, a soft murmuring in a language she didn't recognize. One afternoon, she pressed her ear to the locked door and froze. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. Determined to understand what was happening, Emily began exploring the building. In the basement, she found an old trunk filled with belongings left behind by previous tenants. Among the items was a leather-bound journal. Its pages detailed strange occurrences, footsteps in empty hallways, objects moving on their own, and a tenant who disappeared without a trace. That night, Emily awoke to a strange sensation, like someone was in the room with her. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw it. A shadow, tall and gaunt, standing at the foot of their bed. It didn't move, but she could feel its gaze. When she blinked, it was gone. Unable to take the fear and uncertainty any longer, Emily convinced Jake to break the lock. Armed with a crowbar, they pried it open. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a small, empty room. But the walls, they were covered in scratches, as if someone had been clawing to get out. Panicking, Emily and Jake tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, and the whispers turned into agonized screams. Just when it seemed they would be trapped forever, the door burst open, and they stumbled into the hallway. Behind them, the room was empty again, as if nothing had happened. Emily and Jake moved out the next day, but the experience stayed with them. Weeks later, Emily received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was the photograph from the room and a note that read, "Welcome home." James, a man in his mid-30s, had just moved into a modest suburban home. Recently divorced and eager to start fresh, he sought solace in the quiet neighborhood. His new home was unassuming, but to James, it was a clean slate, a chance to leave behind the chaos of his previous life. As he unpacked, he noticed his neighbor across the street, an elderly woman tending to her garden. Her name was Mrs. Henderson, a frail woman in her 70s. She worked silently, snipping flowers with trembling hands. James waved to her, hoping for a friendly gesture, but Mrs. Henderson merely glanced at him with a blank expression. She returned to her work, leaving a basket of freshly picked flowers by her mailbox before disappearing into her home. That night, James lay in bed, struggling to sleep. The new house was too quiet, the silence unnerving. As he stared at the ceiling, he heard faint footsteps outside. Curious, he peered through the curtains. To his shock, Mrs. Henderson stood in the middle of the street, staring directly at his house. Her posture was stiff, her face partially obscured by shadows. James felt a chill run down his spine. The next morning, he found a bundle of flowers on his doorstep, tied with a black ribbon. There was no note, no explanation. He looked across the street, but Mrs. Henderson's house appeared lifeless, the curtains drawn tightly shut. James decided to ask about Mrs. Henderson at the local grocery store. As he chatted with the cashier, he brought up his silent neighbor. "Oh, you mean the old widow?" the cashier said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "She's been here forever, keeps to herself. But be careful. Weird stuff happens to people who get too close." James chuckled nervously, dismissing the remark as small-town superstition. But as he left the store, he noticed Mrs. Henderson standing outside, watching him. Her gaze was piercing, her expression unreadable. One night, James heard strange noises coming from the basement, soft scratching and faint whispers. Grabbing a flashlight, he descended the creaky stairs. At the bottom, he found a single withered flower, identical to the ones Mrs. Henderson left. The air was thick with the odor of decay, making him gag. The next morning, he discovered an old photograph tucked inside his mailbox. It showed a young Mrs. Henderson standing in front of his house. Her face was youthful, but her eyes had been scratched out, leaving jagged marks on the photo. James felt unease creeping into his bones. Determined to uncover the truth, James visited the local library. Hours of research revealed an unsettling history. Decades ago, a family had gone missing from his home. The last person to see them alive was Mrs. Henderson. She had been questioned, but was released due to lack of evidence. That night, James's curiosity got the better of him. He crossed the street and knocked on Mrs. Henderson's door. When there was no answer, he tried the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a pristine yet eerie interior. The air smelled faintly of flowers and something rotting. On the mantel, James found a row of photographs. Each depicted a different family, and in every photo, the eyes had been scratched out. As he studied the images, Mrs. Henderson appeared behind him, her voice soft and chilling. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. The next morning, the neighborhood was calm. A moving truck pulled up to James's house as a new family arrived, excited to start their life in the quiet suburb. They glanced at the house and saw James standing in the window, smiling eerily. His expression was vacant, his eyes unblinking. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson tended to her garden, humming softly. She placed fresh flowers by her mailbox and glanced at the family, her face breaking into a wide, unnatural grin.